All right. So today we are joined with Miss Noelle Mering. Um, she is the author of a few books that I find really interesting. We're going to be talking today about primarily about one of them. It is titled Awake, Not Woke, which is a fairly provocative title, and I think that it's an aptly titled book. Before we get started, Noelle, I was wondering if you might just want to give just kind of a quick introduction of yourself and maybe what prompted you to write this book, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name's Noelle. As you said, I am a wife and mother of 6 children living in Southern California. My background is in philosophy. However, I spent most of my years raising babies. And over the past 5 or so years have gotten back into a bit more of the academic world. I've been writing articles and have co-authored 2 books called Theology of Home 1 and 2 with different subtitles, and then Awake, Not Woke now. I'm a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in DC. And I think that's about it. Editor for theologyofhome.com. We have a website that corresponds with the books. And I wrote this latest book. I'm really passionate about this topic, mostly because I find that the woke movement is harmful to the very people it aims to help. So actually there were a couple of things that got me started about writing the articles about wokeism. I've been writing about it for about 2.5 years. Some instances where I saw Christians in particular were getting pulled into a social justice movement that led to a harshness that I found to be increasingly merciless. And that seemed really ironic for something that was, supposed to be built around encouraging us to be more loving. But the thing that actually set me off to write the book, and I think I've only told this in one other interview, but since this is more long form. So I went to an evangelical liberal arts college, and I started hearing all these stories about how the students at it's sort of an affluent Southern California liberal arts evangelical school, they were protesting with just super dramatically protesting. Like donors would come to the campus, they'd put tape over their mouths saying resist, they held up signs, and the thing that set them off was that there was a chapel on the school that had been donated in the 1950s when the first president of the college daughter died in a car accident, and it depicted Christ with Caucasian skin, and they wanted that changed out. And in some ways that's not a bad thing to want changed out. We should have depictions that are reflecting, obviously, the Catholic Church is renowned for having depictions of Mary and Christ with all sorts of different ethnicities. And I think that is a good thing. But the reaction was so overwhelming, so extreme, so disproportionate, I think, from what was going on. And it really made me think about what life was like when I was in college. When I was in college, I was one of the only Catholics at the school. A lot of people, I got made fun of for that. People would surround me and badger me for being Catholic, and good fun, but still, it was very easy to feel different. Sure. I also wasn't like this OC kind of girl, tanned, and, I was just felt different in a lot of ways. And not to compare that to, being oppressed. I'm just saying, my point is that while I was there, everything in my maturation process pointed me to trying to get past those differences, to understand that people aren't necessarily against me, that I'm not being made fun of in, these interactions, that people are goodwilled, and to let things roll off my back. And how different it is for the students now, where it really seemed like they were looking for ways in which they can be outraged. All these affluent, white OC students, not to dismiss them because of that, but just saying that these are generally not students who have led intense lives of oppression. But they began to see that to mimic the elite culture, you had to sort of exude this sense of fighting some sort of political oppression wherever you can find it. And that to me was a really fascinating, and ultimately I thought detrimental a climate to be growing up in. And it really made me feel sad for them that they, in this time when they could be being formed in the intellectual life, the interior life, that instead it was being taken over with politics. And that seemed to really regretful.
Yeah. And you say something, well, I mean, you said a lot of interesting things there, but you mentioned that it seemed like they were trying to mimic or impersonate the elite class in terms of needing something to oppose or needing something to fight against or push back against. And that strikes my memory of something that Jordan Peterson likes to say from time to time. And from reading your book, I get the impression that you are an admirer of Dr. Peterson, as am I. And one of the things he likes to point out, or he points out when on topics like this, is he points out that it's quite a thing for particularly kids who are at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, any of those top shelf schools. It's quite a thing for them to assume the mantle of victimhood, because just by virtue of being students where they're guaranteed to live, I don't want to say effortless lives, but live lives of as close to effortless privilege as one could ever hope to attain. And it, granted, not every university in the world is like Harvard or Yale, but that attitude of looking to be victimized does seem to be looking to be victimized or looking to be offended, as you said, does seem to be prevalent. When, again, I don't know the statistics. I'm not a numbers guy very much, not as much as I'd like to be, but it's not unreasonable to say that just by attending a college anywhere in the world, for that matter, by going to college, you're automatically on one of the top shelves of the human race. Like most people, all told, 7 billion, 8 billion people in the world, going to college is a privilege. And so the idea of feeling oppressed when at the same time you're on this fast track to some kind of rarefied success, all things considered, does seem a little suspicious. You write about victimhood culture. Do we freeze again? There we go. You write about victimhood culture in the book, and we'll get to that here in a few minutes. But I thought that was an interesting observation to make, and certainly worth considering.
Yeah, I mean, it goes right. Yeah, I think that there's an incentivization to align yourself with a victimhood culture now, right?
Yeah.
And for the elite. Okay. I think that for people who find themselves on the side of the elites, or the side of, in this reductive kind of worldview, the side of privilege, it's almost like a deflection, right? That you have to, if you're bought into this whole metric that, there's these simplistic binaries of oppressor and oppressed, yeah, and you find yourself on the side of oppressor, well, then the only way you're going to be able to deflect from that is by doubling down on the same simple binary, and on the correct side. So I think that these students quickly saw that the road to virtue was not through the traditional means of the small unglamorous work of struggling against your sins and your laziness and your ego and your pride and your addictions or whatever, but rather that there was this sort of a new road to virtue, which was aligning with this correct abstraction or this correct ideology. And that is your way, as much as you can mitigate your privilege, it's by doing that.
Yeah.
And so there is some motivation there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like it's unearned virtue. Like you said, you're not struggling for it. You're not wrestling, again, to use Peterson language, you're not going out and fighting the dragon. You're just kind of looking for a dragon that's been killed and then planting your flag there and saying, you know, look what we've all done. Yeah, it's a hell of a phenomenon for sure. And I want to get into all that. But before we do that, before we really dive in, I wanted to share a few thoughts, just a few initial thoughts that I had regarding Awake Not Woke. And I was struck. I was struck reading your book by two things. One, the first one that I was struck by immediately, and it's because you literally opened the book with this, is how focused on language the approach that you took toward the book was so focused on language and the words that we use. You know, and we can go into that as to why you think that is. But you have a quote here, again, on page 3, you write, a breakdown in our common understanding of words leads to a society in chaos and frustration, inevitably miscommunicating and plagued by distrust. We become suspicious not only of each other, but of ourselves and our ability to grasp reality. Rather than a fallible people struggling imperfectly toward a harmonious common good, we are a cacophony screaming across a chasm for recognition and moving through the world without a destination. And one, I love the imagery of that, of a cacophony screaming across a chasm. That's excellent alliteration. But like I say, there's this recurring theme throughout the book that the words we use matter. Is that something that you were conscious of while you were writing, or is that something that just like came out in the process? Tell me about that.
You know, in some ways, I feel like I backed into this, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the dogmas, but this idea that this is fundamentally against the logos. Just in trying to distill and understand this movement, it really became clear to me at some point, wow, this really is targeted at the logos. Yeah. And language kind of flowed from that, obviously, because language is, you know, the way that we manifest the logos amongst each other. Talking about Jordan Peterson, he talks about how the word dialogue, you know, is dual logos. That the reason why it's so important to dialogue is because we can't just sit with our own thoughts and expect them to be well formed. You know, we have to actually be in the moment, challenged by each other, yeah, and sharpening each other and having to recalibrate. This is how we struggle, and, you know, in our clumsy and small ways, try to arrive at the truth in our lives. The truth not just out there, but the truth about ourselves. And that breakdown, which is, you know, pretty explicit in the postmodernists, they were, you know, that the idea that language is not a means towards arriving at any sort of truth, but just a means to dominate each other. Yeah. And I think that is the way that this movement is most clearly and immediately manifest, is in the breakdown in language, right? That words have taken on all sorts of different meanings. They're manipulated. We're constantly fighting each other with slogans, you know, that words have become sort of this weapon. Or even like with the transgender movement, with pronouns, the idea that if someone doesn't acknowledge your pronoun, that they are questioning your very existence. This is the language we use now. It really cuts to the heart of the human person. And I think it's connected to the way in which, if we can define who we are out just in denial of even bodily reality, but just with a word that we choose, well, then someone can extinguish who we are with the words that they choose or use. And so words become both like malleable and also a bludgeon that we can use to hurt each other. And, you know, it really makes us unable to have any sort of connection with one another. It's a total rupture of human beings, one from the other, and also person from himself or herself, and ultimately ourselves from God. So it just seemed like the thread that was woven throughout what was happening here had to do with the word and words in general.
Yeah. And you mentioned how we use, there's a lot of sloganeering that goes on these days. I swear this is not just a podcast to promote Jordan Peterson, but I was listening to a recent interview of his. I can't remember who it was with. Maybe it was with, I can't remember who, but it was a very fascinating interview. And they were talking about this use of language. And Dr. Peterson pointed out that, and I haven't fact checked this, but I trust trust enough of what he said to believe him here, that the original use of the word slogan, like the etymology of slogan, it translates to something like the cry of the dead or the battle cry of the dead. It's this idea of something you say when you're up against the wall and there's just not a whole lot left, like there are no arrows left in the quiver, so all you can really do is throw the bow, kind of thing. And yeah,
Wow.
there seems to be a lot of that going on. There seems to be a lot of redefinition of redefinition of marriage to begin with. That, that's kind of like the headline example. But what was the word? It was a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago. There was, I think it was in the Supreme Court, or it was something in Washington, and they had just happened to suddenly, some governing body just happened to suddenly redefine the meaning of, like, I think maybe sexual harassment or something. I can't remember what it was, but they up and redefined the word. They said, well, this now means this. And everyone just sort of took to it like, okay, so that's how we use this word now. And it shouldn't be that way, right? Like, it shouldn't be that easy to just say, well, now this means this, and so get on board with it. Words have meaning.
Well, yeah, it just seems like a means of control. I mean, it feels very Orwellian.
Yeah. Like, words have meaning. They have power. They have they have meaning, they have weight, they have purpose, and we seem to just in the rush to make the world how we want it to be rather than how it is, we seem to be under the impression that we can just make words. Like kids today, they don't even use words. They use like, yeah, things are fire right now, things are 100, and all this, and it's like, there's a certain amount of that in youth, but there's also just that sort of thing seems to be going on where we just make up our own language and we make up our own realities and just expect everyone to go along with it. And how does one create an identity when their identity is constantly shifting? It's perplexing. So the other thing, just real fast, the other observation I wanted to make about this book, and then we're gonna jump into it with both feet, is I wrote in the margins in this book several times. I wrote something to the effect of Noelle Mering pulls no punches, because this book is it's very direct, and it's very honest, and it's very at times humorous. Like, you use some examples that I thought were, and I can't remember any off the top of my head, but there were several times where I just wrote like, ha, in the margin, because it's like, how is this happening in the real world? How is this happening and no one's like batting an eyelash at it? And I wish I had some of those examples, but I don't, but I know that they're there. So the first real question I want to ask you is, how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where reality becomes such, as you said, such a malleable thing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that I go through the history in the book of, I think this was very premeditated, and we can talk about that. But I think that the way that we have gone along with it is because we have stopped seeing the great importance and meaning, in some ways, behind having a cultural meaning. And I think that oftentimes it was because it seemed like maybe we would be strident or sticklers for language, or not, afraid of not being on board with the latest progressive incarnation of compassion. And I think that sort of intimidation is understandable, because there are, like for example, the very banal anodyne phrase that people say all the time, it's better to be kind than right. I kind of hate that phrase because I feel like it's a substitute for really thinking. However, and I think I even talk about this in the book, there are certain times, the Christian is not meant to be a scold who's just going around wagging his or her finger around at everyone and correcting everything that's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that the media in particular did such an effective job in portraying that stereotype of Christianity, from everything from the church lady in Saturday Night Live to, countless characters in movies and television shows. I really think that had a huge effect in our imaginations, that we realized at some level, okay, you're the bad guy if you're, you hold to a certain moral norm, or you're, this doesn't look, it's not a good look, and it's not ultimately compassion. It's not actually ultimately going to win people over or, convert people to Christianity. And I think we were so eager to avoid that pitfall that we missed the huge abyss that we were walking into, because we let so much go, in that process for so many years. And so, it's a big question. And I do think that it's been a top-down effort in most ways, from the academy to various institutions, to media, to popular culture. But I do think that if we're going to self-reflect as well, that there is a way in which I think that we didn't fully understand what was happening and kowtowed to all of the tactics of getting this widespread. So now I think people are seeing now it's escalated quickly, and now it's everywhere.
Yeah. And how familiar are you with Alexander Solzhenitsyn?
I love him.
Love him.
I mean, I've read everything he's written, but I love the Harvard speech. I read big excerpts of the Gulag Archipelago, and I love the Harvard speech.
Yeah, that was what hooked me on Solzhenitsyn. That was the first thing I ever read by him, and I remember it wasn't like, oh, what's this guy driving at? It hit me at the end of the first paragraph, and I have these words chiseled onto my soul, and I think that they're germane here. He ends that first paragraph with basically a warning to everyone who's in attendance, which I don't know if you've ever looked at the list of the people who graduated from Harvard in 1978,
No.
But there were some pretty impressive names who probably were in attendance for that address, which, given the nature of it, I think is good and fitting.
Yeah.
But he opens the address by pointing out that the motto for Harvard University is veritas, which in Latin means truth. And then he immediately goes into the best just like shot across the bow, I think, in the past 100 years. He says, "The truth is seldom pleasant. It's almost invariably bitter. Know that I come to you today not as an enemy, but as a friend." And then he completely, tears apart the modern Western liberal process. But what got me about Solzhenitsyn, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, what got me about Solzhenitsyn was the way that he managed to speak so honestly and so fearlessly. And granted, a lot of that comes from his time in the Gulag and standing up to the Soviet Union, but he speaks so effortlessly, courageously, and he incorporates his faith as an Orthodox. I believe he was Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, I can't remember which, but he incorporates his faith so seamlessly without being heavy-handed with it. He doesn't, the modern idea of sharing one's faith is something akin to, well, in the Bible it says this and this and this, but he takes the principles of his faith and shows how they can be used in a practical setting. And it's very effective. I think it's very effective. Between the Harvard address, the Templeton address, there are a few others, but I don't even know how to describe him, even after all this time. But what are your thoughts on maybe like that approach of just being honest and fearless, but not in a, like you say, not in a scold kind of way?
Yeah, I think this is that's such an important question. And I think the reason why he's so effective is it becomes from this rich, deep, incomparably deep, almost interior life that he must have had at that point that was well earned from human suffering,
Yeah.
right? And that gave him an intense amount of interior freedom that led to like a wholeness of the human person. So, for example, one of the things I'm always, encouraging people to have clarity and to have courage.
Mhm.
But one of the pitfalls of that is that, sometimes the loudest people are the people who are you least want to be your spokesman. Because oftentimes the more we are trying to really understand these things and really also struggle with our own sins, right? Which is where any sort of authority that we have to speak on any matter
Yeah.
has to start with, integrity, that we are, fighting to live the same principles in our own interior life and our private lives that we are espousing. And oftentimes that struggle makes us more humble, and it makes us almost less, it can make us more hesitant because we see so much complexity. There's moral complex, and we see the, mercy that everyone needs, and how, there's no cartoon in this world. There's human persons who are suffering and really struggling, and these things can be hard to talk about. And then sometimes when we're less interiorly in that rich place, it's easier to be a clanging cymbal, and just blather on. And so that is the trick, is that the way to be speaking with that sort of unabashed courage but also that winsome kind of effect that he had is really comes from this interior depth that he had. And there's no shortcut to that.
Yeah.
That's what's hard. You can't perform it. You can't perform it. And that's what makes all of this incredibly complicated and tricky, is that, I think we're espousing, these are the highest and best ideals possible, right? Christ represents the very best, supernaturally and naturally, all the human virtues, all the supernatural virtues. And that's a tall order, it's a tall order to preach that when we are so small and fallible and weak, and people are so eager to find hypocrites, and that's the other thing. I think talk about the media, the paradigm of the who is bad and who is good, and this church lady and all these things. Yeah. The worst thing the worst image in the world now is the person who puts himself up above others, or that. And for a good reason, because there is something very distasteful about someone who does that when it's not warranted, and it's obnoxious and it's self-aggrandizing, and but I think we also have to not be so afraid of that, that we crawl into a little shell or become into a little insular bubble, right? Like, these things are things that matter deeply, and the Holy Spirit can work through us and make our meager efforts better than what we can make of them on our own. And silence is sort of not an option anymore either, because there's a real human harm. And was my driving motivation for the book. It's not because I want to own the libs or anything like that. I just truly thought there are people being harmed deeply by this ideology for generations. There's a generational harm that's going to happen here. And it spreads like a virus. And that seemed like something that we can't not speak on or speak about.
Right. Yeah. It's and the idea that it's generational. I think that at least my thought on that is that it kind of moves forwards and backwards. Like, what we're doing now is obviously going to have a ripple effect for your children, my children, their children after that, if we don't find a way to, at the very least, balance what is happening with cancel culture and what is happening with just the what seems to be the unhindered movement of like Ireland getting so excited, this Catholic country getting so excited with passing abortion laws that make it so easy. And like, if we don't see what we're doing now, when we're drunk right now, the world is drunk right now, and if we don't sober up quick, I think we're going to find that the car is wrapped around a tree, and at that point it's going to be like, well, it's totaled, what do we do now? But I also think it goes, I think that I think that the generational comment is a good one. And this kind of leads into my next question and my next point about your book that I found so fascinating was it's billed as an intellectual, in part, an intellectual history of woke ideology. And I thought to myself, how can that be if woke is such a relatively new thing, but you actually go back quite a ways to something called the Frankfurt School. And I had heard about that just in my own extracurricular readings, but I didn't really know much about it. So I wonder if you could maybe just give a brief, if that's even possible, just give a brief history of what the Frankfurt School was, who were some of the big players, and what were some of their ideas before we move into how those ideas now connect to the present.
Sure. Okay, so the Frankfurt School began in Frankfurt, Germany, and came to Columbia in 1935. And it was a group of Marxists who were disappointed because the revolution had not come to be. In Germany, Marx had believed that it was inevitable, that the proletariat would just rise up and topple the ruling class, eventually coming to this sort of utopian state. That did not come to pass. And so they formed this institute to try to examine why. And following along with Antonio Gramsci, they came to determine that it's not just economics that need to be addressed. It's actually that the power structures in society are far more pervasive, encompassing law, popular culture, news, the schools, and that the real revolution would come only by subverting all the halls of power, all those institutions. Ultimately by criticizing and rejecting all that is. And so they formed and came to Columbia, and then what they came up with was what we now call critical theory, or they began to call critical theory. Critical theory is a fusion of this sort of neo-Marxism that keeps the oppressed classes, but broadens it into all these other categories, eventually including sexuality, gender, race. And then a fusion of neo-Marxism and also neo-Freudianism. So many of these Marxists were really taken up by the thought of Freud. And so the neo-Freudianism kind of encompasses this idea that there is, that human beings are polymorphously perverse, and that part of our liberation is not just by fighting the oppression outside of ourselves, but fighting the oppression inside of ourselves in the form of our own sexual repression. And then that's a sort of toppling of any moral structure or moral norms is another way that we combat the hegemonic forces that dominate society.
Yeah. Yeah.
So some of the figures were,
Go ahead.
So that, Horkheimer, Adorno, I would say the biggest celebrity Frankfurt School guy was Herbert Marcusa, who was a big figure in the 60s. He had a huge influence. He wrote a pivotal essay called Repressive Tolerance. He also wrote One Dimensional Man. He was a mentor for, the Weathermen, who became to be known as the Weather Underground, Angela Davis. Actually a lot of the revolutionaries in the 60s who then went on to run like the teachers' colleges in the United States. So yeah, their influence was broad and still with us today.
Do you think that makes me wonder, because it's fun to think about conspiracy theories, but it's you need to be cautious, I suppose, and not letting them get out of hand. Do you think that the Frankfurt School, the people that you just mentioned, do you think that they had this long game in mind? Like, do you think that the things that they were discussing, the critical theory, all the things that they were kind of figuring out how they wanted to turn over on their heads, do you think that they had in mind that this would be a multi-generational, perhaps even multi-century endeavor? Or do you think that they maybe didn't give it that much thought, that maybe these ideas would live and die with them? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, according to their writing, they very much thought that this would be a generational revolution that would go underground and be subversive, but eventually would topple the West. I mean, they were quite explicit about that. And that's where you get it's attributed to Gramsci, but it's actually, I think, an interpreter of his that came up with the phrase, a long march through the institutions.
Yeah.
just that this would take a long time, but it would be a bloodless, in some ways, revolution. I mean, actually, there are human casualties in the form of abortion and also human mutilation in the transgender movement, but it is a cultural revolution that they very much explicitly understood to be a long game that would eventually affect the West and weakening the family first and foremost, and then the churches and the society at large.
That's kind of incredible. It's kind of incredible. And while I don't like what I've read about the Frankfurt School, you have to at least respect their longevity of thought, because I mean that's impressive for them to have that. Because I mean, like today, it's, you know, if an idea can last an entire presidential administration, we call it a well thought out idea. And here are these people who are thinking, you know, generations ahead of their time. But that's where my admiration, I guess, for that stops. I'm just looking over my notes here because there's so much in that. There's so much to go over, and there's so much that I want to hit on. So much to do, so little time. Yeah, so I guess I'll move on to the other stuff that I was hoping to get to, rather than fall down too many rabbit holes at once. So in your book, you lay out these three dogmas of wokeism, I guess we can call them. And you say that they are group over person, will over reason, and there's a third one, power over authority. And I wonder if you can maybe just walk us through those three, and I'll jump in with a few questions I have here and there. But let's start with group over person. What is that about?
Sure. So the idea is that that we, you know, I mean, obviously the Marxist framework of pitting group against group is crucial to the success of the movement. You know, it's divide and conquer. But the interesting thing to me about it, or one of the interesting parts about it, is that it really becomes clear that it's not really the individuals of the group that are meant to flourish. So for example, I use this example, and I think in that chapter, in 2017, when there was the Women's March, there was a group of pro-life feminists who wanted to march alongside them. And they were told by the Women's March they could have no official affiliation, even though they agreed with everything that the march stood for, except for abortion. Yeah. But because the way they have redefined the human person as being first and foremost defined by oppression, means that if you are not fighting the ultimate symbol of your oppression, which is your pregnancy, then you are somehow falling short. You're not fully living your womanhood, as if womanhood is defined by oppression. So in other words, it's not these individual women that they want to flourish. It's the ideology that needs to flourish. And the same thing, if you're a conservative Black man, you'll be told that you're racially Black, but not politically Black, because you're not furthering the ideology. So it's really all about the ideology rather than the individual. The individual becomes reduced to like a totem of a movement, or, you know, an instantiation of the movement, rather than in a healthy society, the group and the person are harmonious. You see that most explicitly in the family, where the good of the individual is the good of the group. But this really pits individual against group in a way that only one can succeed. And for the ideology, it's going to be the group think.
Yeah, and that politically Black versus racially Black, that and the Women's March for that matter, it strikes me as just, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, like how is it possible to hold up these ideas, these beliefs? You know, the Olympics just started, so I feel good using this. Like, what kind of mental gymnastics do you have to do to be able to say, oh, well, you're just racially Black, you're not politically Black? And the other side of that is, what does it mean to be politically Black? Or what is it, I guess you could say, what does it mean to be politically female? Since, as you say, it's not enough to be a woman to participate in the Women's March, you have to be a woman who shares in the ideology. And you even write, sharing in group membership is necessary but not sufficient. You must share in the ideology itself. It's not enough to be, you're Black and that's great. You're a woman and that's great, but that's not enough. You have to believe what we tell you to believe. Otherwise, like you say, you're still, part of that oppression. And so this is good, because this is where I wanted to talk about the honor culture, the dignity culture, the victim culture. You use the example of the Wild West as the honor culture, and you write that reputation is highly valued. People avoid appearing cowardly, and there's usually an appeal to some sort of authority, and when there's a problem that needs to be arbitrated. Obviously, we don't have a lot of duels going on anymore, so I think that we've probably moved away from honor to the next one, which is dignity culture. And for dignity culture, right, recognition of inherent worth of each person is prioritized, tends to be law-based. That sounds good enough. I think the dignity culture is probably fine. But then we get to victim culture. And you write that it looks like we are moving from dignity to victim culture. And we talked about this at the beginning, how it seems like the way these woke ideas spread is through people who are trying to earn some sort of virtue, trying to appear virtuous at the very least. And it should be said that behind wokeism, I think that there are good intentions. I think that they're just maybe not as well conceived as they could be. And I'd like to get to that point here in a few minutes. But you write victim status. I know I'm just reading from your book, but you just word everything so well here that I don't want to step on it. Victim status bestows moral status on a person. How can that be? And this is my question, how can being a victim bestow a moral status on a person? What is the mindset behind that?
Well, I mean, I think that we're so embedded in it that it's almost hard to see how it's not that, I mean, if you're in a conversation with someone and they talk about how they've been harmed in a certain way, I mean, there's an immediate credence and gravitas that's given to their words. And in some ways that's appropriate, right? The problem is that if we have created moral stature or status as bestowed by finding yourself as a victim, it creates this perverse incentive to scan for ways in which you are injured, whether or not that they're things that you would necessarily by nature want to marinate on, or you would get over naturally, right? It kind of encourages us to sit in that place of being hurt or harmed, or and to look for those opportunities where you might be further harmed. So I say in the book somewhere, it creates we have this supply and demand problem, where the supply of, people are far more tolerant. I come from a mixed race family, my father and mother. And for them, someone got angry at me at one point because I said something about how we've made great progress. And they said, what's the evidence of the progress? And it's like, well, look at mixed race marriages. That's rightly so, far more embraced than it would have been 50 years ago. And she got really mad and said, I don't remember why. She thought that I was dismissing, I wasn't, I was just trying to state what I think is a clear fact. I mean, my parents 50 years ago would have had a far harder time in many parts of the country than they would today. And that just seems undeniable to me. So the supply of victimization in those certain ways in some ways have gone down for women and for and racial minorities and for different sexualities. Women have other problems now, obviously with the Me Too movement, and that's a whole other conversation we can have. But the demand to find ways in which we are victimized has gone way up. And so it creates this desire for microaggressions, right? I think this is kind of partially where microaggressions come from. I think there's a couple of provenances, but that as the supply has gone down so much and as our demand has increased, we need to find instances in which we're victimized where normally I don't think we would see them. That's a really psychologically unhealthy place to be in, right? I mean, I'm sure that I've known people who are, you can use your injuries like a trophy, right? Where it shields you from having to take responsibility of your life, or, I know this psychology intimately in my own life with people I know. And it's really, it really is it's such a hard way to move through life. You only really hold yourself back and hurt yourself. But we're creating that sort of psychological instinct, or I'm not using the right language. Obviously, I'm not a professional in this, and as you are, but we're creating that incentive that is extremely unhealthy through this sort of victim culture. And it's on a collision course with a dignity culture. So we grew up with that phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It's sort of, it's obviously a little trite childhood thing, but I remember saying that all the time when I was little. We've gone way past that now. Words can actually eradicate me now.
Oh yeah, words are, interestingly, both words and silence, they're both now violence. My words can be used as a form of violence, but also paradoxically, when I don't use my words, it's also violence.
Yeah, the only option left then is to say it's compelled approved speech. Yeah. You can't be silent and you can't dissent. So the only thing you can do is use your voice to support the ideology.
Yeah, and that just goes back to the whole idea that language plays such an important part, because particularly last year with all the George Floyd stuff, there were a lot of voices were saying that it's time for white people to basically shut up and listen. Okay, so let's stop talking and start listening. But then there were also people saying, but you'll never understand my experience. Okay, so if I'm listening, what am I listening for if I can't understand what it is I'm hearing? And so it's this very tense, it's a very narrow strait to navigate, because I can't.
It's a wall.
Yeah, I can't listen, but I can't speak either. And so, like, what are other options are there? Like, it's
and that was very deliberate. I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw writes about that you no longer say I am a man or a woman who is Black. You say I am a Black woman, because your Blackness, the part of your identity that is oppressed, is far more important than the part of your identity that is universal with other human beings. Right. So it's by design to have that sort of wall erected.
Yeah, and it's the imagery of a wall, I think, is very interesting, and I think it's a good analogy, because we live in a time where everyone's talking about like tearing down the walls and celebrating people's differences and all these things, when at the same time we seem to be falling over ourselves to wall ourselves off by picking exactly what our identity is and expecting everyone to identify us in that same way. It seems almost like we're wanting to run a marathon, but we're also burying our feet in cement. Again, as I'm speaking to you, I'm just trying to work all this stuff out, because however much I experience it and read about it, I can't wrap my mind around it.
Yeah. And well, you're touching on something which I think is fascinating. For the same way that we're starting to segregate kids according to race, not only in school but in dorms. Some liberal progressive colleges are trying to have Black dorms and white dorms. What have we been doing for the past 10 years? We've been desegregating them according to gender. So you're touching on some sort of incoherence, whereas, with the genders, the male and female actually imply some sort of difference in behavior, right? Yeah. That they should be segregated by gender because it's more appropriate. Showers, bathrooms, all propriety generally. Sure. Whereas the races, there's no reason to segregate people by gender according to race. There's no difference in behavior. You don't treat each other differently. There's no propriety issue.
Yeah.
But in treating those two categories differently, you create broader categories of enemies across humanity. Because men and women eradicating the difference between men and women creates Harvey Weinstein. It creates, it creates the Me Too movement. It creates the meaninglessness of the female body, which is inherently more vulnerable than the male body. And that implies some reverence owed from the male towards the female, because she is more vulnerable and because she can bear life, that there's a way in which a man needs to be manly and protective over that.
Yeah.
And you eradicate that, all of a sudden you have predators, right? You have women who are vulnerable and don't know how to put a finger on how the way that they're being harmed, and all these things, this whole host of pathologies that come from that. But with the races, we're doing the exact opposite. We're saying we're doing the exact opposite what Martin Luther King Jr. would have said, right? Which is to focus on a universal brotherhood and sisterhood of men and women. Instead, we're going to focus on our division racially.
Yeah. And MLK Jr., he's an interesting, he's always an interesting figure, but he's particularly interesting lately because, and I think you maybe point this out in the book, you reference his letter from Birmingham jail. And, he dreamed of a world where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the, I can't remember the exact quote.
Content of the character.
Content of the heart. Yeah, there you go. And he was all about equality, equality, and that's great. But now equality isn't enough. And if you advocate for equality, somehow that makes you racist because you're not going all the way to equity. And it's this moving of the goalposts. It's this redefinition of, you could use any analogy, moving goalposts, slippery slope, redefining language, but it's this idea that if we just get to a point, we'll be like, we've reached our destination, we've reached equality. But as we start approaching equality, now we're pushing the finish line just a little bit further back, and it's equity and equality of outcomes rather than equality of opportunity and all these sorts of things. And it's just like, where does it end?
Yeah, good luck with that. Good luck with trying to get equity of outcome. It takes immense amount of tyranny in order to get anywhere close to that.
Yeah, exactly. But you can't point that out because tyranny is only reserved for a certain class of people, and you can't associate tyranny with something like anti-racism, because how could you do that? But it's when you dig into these words and when you dig into the ideas underlying all of this, it's, again, it all comes back to language. How could someone oppose BLM, Black Lives Matter, for instance? But then you look at their website, and of course this was long since redacted, but you look at their website around this time last year, and they talked about how BLM stood for the abolition of the nuclear family, something to that effect. And of course, like I said, they removed that because they received flack. What does that have to do with Black Lives Mattering? And why do I have to agree with all these things in order to say Black Lives Matter? Because of course all lives matter. So why should I also have to say, and also while we're at it, get rid of the family?
Let's queer the culture.
Yeah,
that gets into the second dogma of the book, which is that because oppression by other groups is intimately tied to sexual repression that we impose on ourselves. So queering the culture is an essential part of racial justice as well. They're all intimately tied together, the minds of the woke.
Yeah, and what exactly do you mean by queering the culture?
So the second dogma in the book that identifies will over reason or nature, and that is rooted in the neo-Freudianism that we're talking about with the Frankfurt School. And the idea is that our oppression is not just outside of ourselves, but inside of ourselves, and that our liberation comes from identifying the sexual desires that we have that are most non-conforming to the cultural mores, and then expressing and living them out. And that's how we become truly liberated. And the weirder those desires are, the greater possibility we have for liberation. This is why pride parades tend to be, competitions and the most outlandish presentation of self. And why children's movies, I talk about this in the book too, they're constantly hammering this message of embrace, fly your freak flag, embrace your nonconformity, be you. And, there's an anodyne and innocuous way that you can interpret that message where, if you have a weird nose, or, you're unusually short, or you have a funny mole, you should, yeah, that's great. Embrace it,
Yeah.
no quirky sense of humor. But this message is so pervasive. It's over and over again. It's just really obvious that this is about the flying your freak flag is about more than that. It's about actually bucking the mores of your society, triumphing over them, liberating yourself.
And this may be a bigger question than we have time for, but why is it so important that we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Like, there are a lot of good things in our traditions, in our past, that have stood the test of time because of their goodness, because of the inherent beauty, the inherent truth of them. Why is it so important that we just completely get rid of all that? Because like the pride parades is a good example, because you say they do tend to be very colorful and very creative, and again, slippery slope, because like what happens when it just turns into a competition of who can outlandish the other person? Like where do we go? You can tell, I'm sure, that I'm perplexed by all of this, because I can't square it with rationality.
Well, I think that they do want to throw the baby out of the bathwater, because that's the point of revolution, really, is to undermine and undermine utterly Western civilization. I mean, it sounds so conspiratorial. Maybe it sounds crazy to say it, but this is all throughout the literature. They were quite explicit about this being the aim. So that doesn't mean that your neighbor down the street or your friend who marched in a parade has this in mind. He or she probably does not want to destroy the culture, doesn't think that that's what they're participating in. But this is the animating revolutionary trajectory. Is that it is that revolutionary ultimately.
Wow. There's an example. There's a parable, I guess you could call it, and I can't remember what it's called, but basically there's a pigeon, and this pigeon is flying and he's flapping his wings and he's gaining altitude. And the pigeon thinks the air around me is holding me down. If only the air wasn't here, I would be able to soar that much higher. Not realizing that it's the airflow and it's all the gravitational forces and all that sort of thing that is actually allowing the pigeon to fly.
No.
And it seems like we're doing that very same thing. It seems like we're saying, if only we didn't have all of these foundations beneath us, we would really be able to build something special. So let's get rid of all these foundations. Well, good luck building any kind of structure without a foundation.
Yeah.
Like the first
and I think we take for granted how much we benefit from that foundation that we want to ruin. I mean, look at the world before the Pax Constantiana, or before Constantine, Christianized the society. Yeah. It was slavery, prostitution, killing of the innocents. It's a brutal world. Yeah. Christianity was a revolutionary idea that human beings have inherent dignity and worth. Yeah. So, well, good luck to us when we undermine all of that utterly.
and that, that calls to mind something that Bishop Barron said, and maybe this is a good transition because I want to be conscious of time, but Bishop Robert Barron of Word on Fire Institute, he likes to use the example when he's talking about like moral relativity and all these sorts of things. He likes to use the example of learning to play an instrument like the piano, the guitar, learning to play a sport like golf. You can sit down at the piano and you can just bang around on the keys, and maybe eventually you'll get to Beethoven, maybe, but more than likely you're just going to be making noise. What is it that allows Beethoven to be Beethoven or Bach to be Bach? it's not their freedom to just do whatever they want. It's it's their understanding of the limits and how an instrument is played, and then with that understanding, effectively and efficiently operating within it. You know, Tiger Woods didn't learn to be Tiger Woods by going out and just swinging at a golf ball. He had to learn how to stand and how to hold the club, how to swing it back. There were a lot of boundaries and limits and rules and things that he had to follow to become Tiger Woods. And he's not going to say like, oh man, if I didn't spend all that time as a kid learning to play golf, I could have been really something special. It's like, no, that was what made him Tiger Woods. But we seem to just think that there seems to be this idea that the rules, the structure, the foundations, whatever you want to call them, that they're holding us back, that they're holding us down. And granted, human history does have some very dark periods, and we've certainly made a lot of mistakes. And you know, human history, we're in the process of correcting them, but let's not overcorrect, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. So, like I said, I want to be conscious of time, but I brought up the fact that you brought this up as well, that you've written a couple of books, and I think that is interesting. I think that this collection of books that you're building for yourself is interesting because, you know, you could say that awake, not woke.
Oh, we're frozen.
Am I frozen? How about now? Still frozen? How about now?
Okay, I got you back. Okay.
Yeah, naturally, today is the day that the internet goes crazy. So you've written Awake, Not Woke, and that's it's a very generous book, and it's a very well written book. But obviously, if you are of a woke persuasion, you're probably going to find it as a fairly combative book, which I think is good. I think it's good to be oppositional as long as you're respectful and you're not just throwing stuff out there. So I think you've done that well. But what strikes me as interesting is that before that you wrote Theology of Home. You wrote both volumes of Theology of Home, and that's something that you're still involved in. And it struck me as interesting, this dichotomy of Theology of Home, which is this very charming book, this very I can think of no other word than just to call it delightful. I loved reading Theology from Home. It was the book I read in the evenings to come down from the day, because it was a warm and, like I said, charming and welcoming book. And so you take that and then you combine it with Awake, Not Woke. And it reminds me of a Chesterton quote, and I'm not going to get it completely right, but Chesterton wrote somewhere that the good soldier doesn't fight because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. Yeah. And it just strikes me as interesting because it seems like Theology of Home, you wrote it with Carrie Grease, who I would also like to talk to. And and it seems like you wrote it for a love of the good things, like the transcendentals, what's good, what's beautiful, what's true. It seems like you, in your personal life, have gone to great care to embody those and to really make the home not just a welcoming place, not just a comfortable place, but a life-giving place. So maybe just tell me a little bit about why you wrote Theology of Home. What motivated that? Because that's an interesting book.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks. I love hearing the way you described it. I thought that was wonderful. So Carrie Gress, my co-author, she and I have been friends. We met in grad school 20 some years ago, and she came up with the phrase Theology of Home. And so we embarked on this maybe 3 years ago initially, and it's been ongoing ever since. We just wrapped up our third book, actually. But I think the idea was that she and I both write against, sort of all these isms, feminism and woke-ism and, all these ideologies. But just as you said, there's also something that they've been destroying that we care deeply about. And the way they've been destroying it oftentimes is through through creating this imagery, in movies and TV shows, and the oppressive, dark family life, and for the woman in particular, and the banality of middle class values, or the work the husband works, and you have this old traditional way of living. How simple and rather stupid it was for the rubes, or for the people who weren't enlightened. And that wasn't my experience. It's not the experience of people I know, Catholic or secular, that, most people care deeply about their home lives and understand that actually, if they're miserable in their home life, they're probably miserable, and that spreads throughout their lives. Right. And whereas you can kind of compartmentalize your job a little bit, if you have like this vibrant interior life of prayer or home life and family. And then actually the way that we've emphasized our public life, to the detriment of our private lives, it's really the inverse of what ought to be happening. We all know that anything good in life comes from it being rooted in, first of all, that interior life, and secondly, in the home. It's actually a movement into the public life where things become, in a way, less crucial, although our public lives are important too. Right. But you're going to become bifurcated at some point if you're not, giving the full attention to, or giving the right attention to, in the right ways, to the right thing. And so I think we just wanted to put something out into the world that portrayed this vital, universally desired thing, home, and really explored that and showed why it's important. It's not just important because we want to impress other people, or I want to, have the best house on the block, or, these things are self-referential, but rather the home can be a signpost towards heaven, the place where we just abide, where we belong, where we're known, where there's true intimacy, where we're not valued for our function or utility, but actually valued for our personhood. And that actually is, an incredibly life-giving, vital piece of humanity that we've neglected for a long time. And you see people wanting it back again. People are having kitchen gardens, and there's this return to like craft and domesticity and all these things. So there's some desire for all of that, but we wanted to create a thread that wove all those things together and spoke to the why. Why are we longing for these things? Why are they important? And why is this good?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to do, because it's, one of the criticisms that people who are not of Christian faith tend to lob at Christians, or even just conservatives maybe, is that we're just defined by what we hate, and we're just defined by what we're against. So Christians are they're just against abortion, they're just against gay marriage, they're just against people being happy and enjoying their life. And it's like, well, you can look at it that way, but there's actually something that we're for behind that. And there's this thread in certainly in Christian philosophy and Christian theology, but it goes further back, that the smallest unit, the most basic unit to civilization is the family. Right? And where does the family live? They live in the home. And if you want to have a family that's at least on the right foot, and granted, family is a complicated thing, and it's not as simple as just having like a lovely home and eating meals around the table, but that's going to go a long way, because it's I like I've said before, I'm a professional counselor, and one thing that I often find with my clients when I ask them, like, what is your home life like? Oh, well, it's chaotic. And the home itself is, I ask them to describe like their living room, their bedroom, their kitchen is chaotic. And so what I try to get them to do is I challenge them to pick one room in the house, or if that's too much, one corner of a room. And again, going back to Jordan Peterson, full circle, make your bed, clean your room. Like, there's something in that. And it's not just the accomplishment aspect of it, but there's also this deeper subconscious element of bringing order to your life. And yeah, it's just, it's hard to put into words. I think that you've put it into better words than I can do. And looking through the book, it looks like you keep a lovely home. I'm certainly envious of the pizza oven. Without a doubt, there were a few pictures in there that I was quite envious that I could not participate in directly.
There were much more lovely homes than mine, but I certainly cleaned up extra that day.
Well, I really did love Theology of Home. It was awesome to see put into words something that a lot of people say is important, but not a lot of people put the time into actually expressing and going into. So I think that it served a really vital purpose, and I hope that that's a project that you and Carrie are going to continue. Sounds like you are. You got another book coming on the way. So, like I said, there was a whole lot more in Awake Not Woke that I wanted to go into. It's an excellent book. I can't applaud you enough. I first became aware of it when I was listening to the Moral Imagination podcast. Shout out to Michael Matheson Miller, excellent show. And I thought, well, that sounds like an interesting episode title. And it was just no turning back after that. I thought it was a gripping read, and I loved every minute that I spent reading it. So I want to give you the last word. Any closing thoughts? Anything that you want to share or say?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I love that you came to it through Michael's podcast. He actually was with Carrie and I at Steubenville that many years ago. So he's an old dear friend of mine, and I think he's an excellent podcast host, great conversationalist, and incredibly well read and smart. So I think that the only thing that I would leave people with, we've had such a good conversation, and I attribute that to you. You were such a good conversationalist yourself. But just that, I think that this is a bizarre time. And the thing I hear most from people is that they sense that something isn't quite right, and they don't know how to put their finger on it. They don't understand, why racial justice entails, sexist sort of sexual freedom, and why there's this effort to silence, and it seems like it goes in one direction. All these things that maybe aren't seeming right. And so I think that I really wrote the book. I'm hopeful that some people maybe will have their minds changed in particular ways. And I've heard a bit of that. But mostly I'm hearing from people who just weren't, very political in either way. And seeing that there's something far more than politics happening. And I do think that this is fundamentally a spiritual battle that at its core, but it's operating on, really corroding the nature of the human person and our ability to be friends. And I think that, the erosion of friendship is one of the saddest parts of all of this, to my mind. So, but on a hopeful note, I think that it's eminently winnable if you want to put it in those types of win-loss terms. But I think this ideology has to be defeated. And one of the things I say oftentimes is that we should remember that, there's a lot of people deceived by it, and a lot of people that are well-intentioned and are seeking the good and seeking love and are harmed and wounded and wanting to be whole. And so we have to fight it with courage, but also with a great deal of compassion and understanding, because it's an ideology that we want to conquer. It's not individuals we want to conquer. We want we want all of us to come out on the other side of this and be able to be friends. So it's a tricky thing to approach, but I think we can do it.
I think we can, and I think that books like yours are a good step in the right direction. It's a great bridge builder, and I hope that it's a line of scholarship that you will continue to pursue, because you have a great grip on it. You have a great voice, and I think that there's still a lot more to be said. So, Miss Mering, I appreciate you coming on. It's been a privilege of mine to speak with you, and maybe I can have you on some other time to talk more about Theology of Home.
Sounds great.
All right,
thanks a lot, Jamie.